Hey y'all, I'm Kelly Moody and you're listening to the Ground Shots podcast, an audio project exploring our relationship to ecology through conversations and storytelling with farmers, herbalists, craftspeople, naturalists, artists, and more.
Lots of locust eaters splits, I offer sweat and splinters. Forest elders breathe their last, I'll bring them for your supper.
Hey y'all, coming at you from outside of Durango, Colorado, where Gabe and I have our big bell tent put up and are harvesting apples and pressing lots of cider these days and enjoying these sort of warm days and cold nights quickly upon us and the beautiful fall leaves falling everywhere. Our camp right now is in a cottonwood grove along a riparian area, and unfortunately it's very dry here, and the creek or river really that runs by our camp would be running by our camp normally is completely dry in the section by our camp. So it's definitely a dry time and the days are getting shorter and cooler, and it's very beautiful and delightful, and we've got our wood stove running in the evenings. Although we're kind of working out the kinks of living in a bell tent, and though we may move it here and there and seasonally, I'm trying to figure out what kinds of things to have in the bell tent that are the best things to have. And our wood stove, which was given to us, is not necessarily the best. It's kind of finicky, so we're kind of looking at like a different one and figuring out how to light it. Just it's really fun to kind of like make a little home. I haven't really done that in a while other than my tiny camper, and just have a little more space to spread out. I really do enjoy hearing all the animals around our bell tent at night and just feeling like I'm in a solid like home but also outside. It's really awesome. This episode of the podcast is the last conversation Gabe and I recorded on our Colorado Trail Plan to Go through hike walk we did this past summer, and we did it from the beginning of July to the beginning of September. And we walked about 600 miles, including side trails that we wrapped back around to on the main trail. And we put out a couple episodes on that walk on the podcast thus far. So some of that might be repetition, just like the nature of that walk. But we're not going to be really talking about like what we did on that walk or like things we were observing necessarily in this episode. But this one is unique because it features a third person who came and joined us for part of the walk, or for a couple days, and it was my friend Téo Montoya. And Téo joined us for a little bit when we were starting the west side of the Collegiate Loop going north. And for CT, people who've hiked the CT or like thinking about hiking it, if you study the trail, you are familiar with like the Collegiate Loop is like a section of the trail where you can split and do two sides, one of two sides, and we ended up doing both. So yeah, Téo came to join us, and through a series of GPS texts and constant changing timing of where we would intersect roads that were accessible for Téo's low clearance car, we ended up being able to meet up, and he had a couple days off, so it was perfect. To give you a little bit of background on who Téo is, Téo Montoya is a Lipan Apache writer, Indigenous futurist, electronic music producer, human design analyst, traditional ecological knowledge student, and educator. After completing his bachelor's in Food and Medical Anthropology with a focus on Indigenous diets and health disparities in Native American communities, Téo spent 5 years exploring the worlds of plant medicine, ancestral health coaching, DJing and producing music, information technology, working with Native-led nonprofits, and completing his human design training. As a writer and creator, he has begun the long process of writing a speculative fiction series and media project imagining future worlds and societies built upon Indigenous values, ideals, and cultures. Téo believes imagining the future, specifically a future grounded in Indigenous knowledge and technology, will provide us with the solutions to meet the largest challenges to Earth and our humanity. Today, Téo lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, writing, producing music, and supporting people on their personal and spiritual health journeys. Téo and I met at the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center in the spring of 2019. The location where Téo joined us on the trail had a lot of mining activity, and part of the trail was even like an old railroad bed for a bit, and it was so easy to tell where mines had been out in the so-called wilderness. There were piles of rocks from underground digging, old metal trash rusted and twisted under growth of like willows or other kinds of trees, and sometimes like the remnants of mining trash were like totally exposed to the sun, because some places nothing still will grow even after all these years. And sometimes you can see this like water with orange on the soil around the water coming out of areas where there was mining activity, and I've seen that in California as well. And even there were deep mining shafts in the ground that they had to put up gates on, that we saw when Téo was with us. And Gabe and I saw places on the trail where this was actually pretty common, aside from this location, and especially in the La Platas, which is like near the part of the trail near the end, near Durango. This episode of the podcast isn't a super formal interview or formal conversation with Téo, though I would love to do a focused conversation with Téo on his writing work and research on native diets. In the future, we've talked about it, so hopefully he can come and meet up with us where we are right now and hang out a little bit, and we can do another episode with Téo, because he has a lot of really cool insights and research that he's done that I would love to share more with this audience. So this episode features snippets of the conversation between Téo, Gabe, and I during dinner, and then again for breakfast, where we dive into candid conversations about some topics that are often difficult to sort through or know how to orient around. And in this conversation, we talk about Téo's thoughts on transcommunality and moving forward into the future by learning from Indigenous wisdom, but also not romanticizing Indigenous peoples and their ways of life. And transcommunality is something that I'd love to talk to more with Téo on the podcast. So hopefully in the future, if we do another conversation, we'll get into that more. We speak on a place for modern technology and new visions for the future, which is something that often people, it feels like there's a dualism in our way of thinking about the future. It's either going to all go to hell and we're all going to be just like living super so-called primitively, and maybe that's the way that we should live or something, or it's going to be this hyper technologicalized culture where we're not in touch with the land at all. And Téo's vision is that there's possibly a future that we can imagine that integrates land connection and complex technologies. So we also talk about rethinking the anti-sacredness of the urban and complex technologies. We also get on some more Russian olive rants. I know that we often talk about invasive plants on this podcast, but it's an ongoing conversation. And we talk about how plants like Russian olive, which are considered invasive, are seen in a certain way because they're used as scapegoats for our cultural mistakes. And we speak on the need for Indigenous wisdom in the Green New Deal talks. We talk about Téo's perspective on white folks or settlers wild harvesting food and medicine and the complexity of this practice. So we do talk about wildcrafting and wild harvesting on this episode and the controversy that is around that. And I haven't really directly talked about that in the podcast yet. I mean, I've asked people questions about their perspective on it from all of the different angles, but this is definitely a more direct kind of conversation visiting the complexity of that. So a lot of it is focused on what Téo's opinion is about that. Téo also tells us a little bit about an Indigenous futurism media project that he's working on, and he got a grant to do this project from when he was living in California. So that's definitely something we would expand on more in a future conversation. I know some of the topics we dip into in this conversation will be controversial, and I personally am open to multiple, sometimes contradictory perspectives at once around certain issues, and it's hard for people sometimes to hold both perspectives at once. I see that though it's difficult for people. Sometimes it's a necessary thing at a time right now where there's such political and social polarization. And even that, some people may not agree with, that it's necessary to hold multiple perspectives. And topics like wildcrafting, for example, to me, whether you're against it or totally for it, require consistent critical conversation and hearing from multiple perspectives and looking at deep time into the future and all of the social, economic, and cultural factors that are at play. And I think that's important for so many issues. And I think that social media is a way to quickly respond from like a reactionism. And I often think that certain controversial topics or really like intense conversations are had on social media platforms like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, where there's a lot of reactionary ways of sort of carrying on the conversation, and sometimes you're literally limited in the number of words you can use, and there's not any nuance to the written word, and people's responses to them can be really reactionary. And I think that it doesn't allow for something that's more multifaceted and nonlinear and sort of evolving and spiraling. And I think that heated conversations, controversial topics can happen in a non-heated way. I think that, like the topic of wildcrafting, for example, which we visit in this conversation, is just it's important to, yeah, like I said, listen to multiple perspectives on it. So holding multiple perspectives can often be met with confused people who still want to label you a traitor for not agreeing exactly with their beliefs. I definitely navigate that. Being from a really conservative place in the deep south, and when I go there, I'm a minority in sort of my perspective on the world and how people should be treated, and basic things are just really different than most people there. And then often, if I'm in like radical leftist type of communities, I'm also kind of an outcast too. And I feel like because I come from a really conservative place, but I also feel like I resonate with radical values as well, I also can kind of critically analyze the tribalism, or like maybe that's not the right word since that word is triggering to use sometimes, but like the kind of banding together in only one way of saying and thinking about something, I think is a better way of saying it. I find those patterns in like both sides of this supposed extreme spectrum of thinking, and I think that I want to think for myself and like navigate for myself what I really feel in my deep heart of things. And sometimes that means that it doesn't quite follow the lingo or the language or like the way of speaking about it that other people are adopting. And I honestly, I don't know, even just saying that, it feels edgy for me, because holding space in a platform like this, you're definitely up for criticism, just as much as you might be up for inspiring people or praise or whatever. And I think it's important that we need to be able to have different beliefs and try to understand where the other's coming from, even if they're totally wrong or you believe they're totally wrong. That's how bridges are created, and maybe someone will change their mind, or maybe they'll actually empathize with your perspective if you actually just listen and not like immediately tell them that they're wrong. So that's just my 2 cents for the moment on that. And I just felt like I needed to kind of get into that for a second in the intro before airing this podcast, just because having conversations about certain things sometimes for me feel edgy and tricky, and I know that not everyone's going to agree. So in this conversation that's pretty candid while we were camping with Téo, he offers a pretty unique perspective as an Indigenous person. That doesn't mean all other Indigenous people agree with him, and as humans, culturally, we are all just as diverse as the plant life that shift and morph from one mountain forest or meadow to another. So just keep that in mind. And with that, let's go ahead and get to this conversation out on the Colorado Trail. The last one we recorded this past summer when Gabe and I did our Plant to Go walk, and it was such a beautiful spot where we recorded this view of a lake and forest and mountains and stuff. So, all right, happy listening, y'all.
Walk warmth of locust cedar splits. I offer sweat and splinters.
I mean, God, think about all the people who just move around for crazy tech jobs and stuff right now. It's like, you never get to create that. Like, the corporation becomes your only sense of belonging.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it would be good if even those small towns, like, more people were on that.
But that's kind of a reflection of culture too, though, is because culture and identity and ecology are also inseparable. And like, once you having an awareness of culture and how it informs you as who you are is a really interesting thing. But like, our culture doesn't have any of these cultural protocols or practices to help inform the individual to actually like take responsibility for their life. So people kind of unconsciously seek identity with place or with job or with some sort of meaningful vocation.
Yeah.
Or subculture.
Or through all
like
kinds of stuff.
A uniform.
Or homogenous American culture too.
Yeah. I mean, I think people unconsciously do this though. And I think that is like inherently an indigenous habit of humans that's part of our DNA that can find unhealthy ways of manifesting itself when it's not grounded
Tribalism and these weird artificial.
in ecology, right? Because that needs grounded. It's like you said about like the shaman and the schizophrenic walk in the same world, but the shaman has like cultural grounding,
Has a context.
in the context to apply that in, right? You know, and that's a similar analogy to like culture and identity and ecology.
Yeah, I mean, we just want belonging.
Yeah.
And it's funny to have belonging without like pluralism. And that's what I love hearing about. I don't know if it was in that Redbird talk or not, but just about how like each of the tribes in the Bay Area would every year, one of them would put on like, they do their dance, their renewal dance at their sacred space, their sacred mountain, their sacred. And so all the tribes had different sacred mountains, like different mountains of origin, but they each acknowledged each other's origins and even like went with them, you know, like,
Wow.
like empowered them. They weren't like, that's you, this is me, right? It was just this understanding. And so it's,
Or like yours is all wrong, but mine's right.
and that's
Like,
what I,
Catholics and Protestants will tell each other they're going to hell because they
Yeah.
got their stories the wrong way. It's told, and I'm like, oh.
yeah, it's like diversity has to be a part of belonging as well, where it's like, you're different than me and we don't believe the same thing, but that's also not a problem.
It's not like, yeah.
You know, it's not something to be hated or feared or, because I love this thing called transcommunality, and it's just about how like communities can essentially work together even though they're very different and achieve, you know, goals that they want together,
Yeah.
but become like never compromise who they are.
Yeah, because I think that the transcommunality, especially right now, I think that needs to be like a tactic for reparations, right? Because that's what it seems that like the lack of that communality is like what makes reparations so hard today.
Yeah, it's so weird when people want to like organize under socialism or something like that. They're still expecting people to be the same. They still want a, you know, a
Everyone to
nation.
agree exactly.
Yeah, they want everybody to have the same culture. They want assimilation, which is just like, it's not healthy. Diversity is like, I mean, another ecological thing. It's like biodiversity directly correlates with the health of an ecosystem.
Yeah.
Because it's more adaptable. Like if you have one way of doing things and something comes along that fucks that up, you're gonna have no other solutions.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, you might, you know, if it's biodiverse, yeah, there might be one group that really gets fucked up, but all these other groups will be fine because, you know, X, Y, and Z.
And they help each other out too,
Yeah.
and there's more than culture. And that's what makes culture, if you think about the culture of in our gut or in like probiotic, right? It's like having a diversity of gut flora. You know, that's what makes culture
We've been
is
talking
actually
about
diversity.
the word diversity a lot because we sometimes go through landscapes that are like don't have a lot of diversity, and like
question whether that's necessarily a bad thing or good thing, or like, what does diversity look like? It's not necessarily just static in one point in time either, you know, and it's like about considering that landscape is just in flux. I don't know. I mean,
like, it's just more complex. It's more chaotic. But that's why you need like systems, like you need like rules that allow it all to work together.
Yeah.
That's why, it's so funny looking at European nations who have like very similar like, you know, a nation will have a way more hegemonic culture, or states, you know, like places that aren't very diverse. They can agree on a lot of stuff and get a lot of stuff done, but they're limited only in what they are, you know? Mm. And that can be like efficient and easy and sometimes like refreshing to not get caught in like bureaucracy and the chaos of diversity. But that's why, there's got to be some sort of like rule of engagement. Yeah, I think the media project itself is kind of like just an experiment with what would it be like to show up and do ritualistic, modern, technological experiencing. You know, like the whole point was to try to like, in the grant was like, what is placemaking? Like, how can we place make in the city? You know, what does that look like? How can we become indigenous to a place, and how can we use modern technology to do it? So kind of like, I kind of hate this analogy, but you know that scene in The Matrix, like where everybody's in the cave and dancing, but it's like, you know, like the rave and music, and it's like, that's forever been, music and dancing has forever been a part of placemaking and being, and but just doing that in a completely modern context while still doing so in a sacred way. Like doing everything intentionally, you know, and having a reason behind each song and having a prayer behind each song, as opposed to just like, this sounds cool, because it can sound cool too. Yeah,
it just seems like it's giving voice in a unique way, that it's giving voice to like indigenous logic. I think like indigenous logic is so misunderstood because it doesn't fall into the confines of Western logic, but it's like giving that a voice and light in a way that's really, and that's the beauty of art, right? Like people sometimes don't know exactly what they're looking at when they see art, but it gets into them, and it plants a seed in there, and that starts to grow. And then that's how the art lives through people, and that's how worlds change, and that's how cultures change. So it's like and that's why I'm so hooked into what you're saying, because it's like you're I don't know, it's like the ancestors are like trying to, they're using you to say something really important about just indigenous ways of thinking and knowing, which is just different and so needed now.
But continuing the narrative of like the indigenous people being technologists and like, you know, coming up with new innovative things, and then imbuing it with like song, being like placemaking, you know, all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
But just using that same exact system, but just for modern technology and like modern ways of being, which is, I just think is like, we have to do that.
Yeah,
it's not easy.
The world needs to listen to indigenous voices, and this is like a really fascinating, almost trickster way of amplifying that, because a lot of people don't want to listen, but Coyote makes people do stuff that they don't want to do that they need to do, you know? So you're using art as the way to do that. And it's just, it's genius.
If you can make it cool too, people will do it.
Yeah.
Well, it's like thinking about traditionalists. Like if traditionalists didn't exist, then we would have lost so much. You know, like there's these people that need to get like, they have to hold on to it. They're the ones who keep it alive. You know, when like the world changes really quickly and traditions fade, then it's those people who become really conservative and very like, it has to be like this, and they keep ideas alive that might be useful again in the future, even if they're not in the present. So I like that, but yeah, it just kind of, it gets stuck. And I think it's really interesting thinking about, you know, so many indigenous worldviews. In native sci-fi, we talk about native slipstream, And slipstream is just kind of how like there's no time is not a thing. Like everything happens at all times. There's very little disconnect between past, present, and future, and myths can be ancient but also now, and storytelling can be about now but also past and in the future. It's like this non-linear time.
Yeah.
And when you're when you're in non-linear time, then like traditionalism doesn't like exist.
We've been talking about that in the context of walking through Colorado and going to places where old settler history is really celebrated, but the truth of it is simultaneously swept under the rug, and how people act like this was a long time ago, but it was really here less than 200 years ago that a lot of these happened, and that how that past, present, future is amalgamated into this moment right now because those mines are still leaking into the rivers. And we walked walking that old railroad grade today.
Those people are dead, but their legacy is still.
It's still, we're walking in their footsteps, and then the tunnels are still here, and how that's still informing today. And like people come here from Texas to come and like be a part of that history that they think is cool and good, but it's like really, I don't know. I think we need to reassess how we relate to history and how
celebrating that history.
Well, that's such a big thing on like just talking about reparations and everything, and people just being like, oh, my ancestors had it rough 200 years ago. Like, why does that matter? What does that affect? How does it change anything? I was like, it changes literally everything. Like, just because you don't think about it, and just because your modern life doesn't need to think about it, does not mean that it doesn't affect
it's like
everything.
Gaslighting. They're like, well, the Irish were enslaved too, so what's the big deal? Can't you just like get over it
I bring
by
that
now?
up, like where I talk about the history of slavery where I grew up, and just how much more inherited wealth and privilege that white folks have there over people of color, especially black folks there specifically. And I hear people make excuses like, well, my family were poor whites, so therefore I don't have privilege, or therefore I don't feel like I need to do anything, or like I don't feel like it's important for me to acknowledge that because my family suffered and we had hardly no food and this and that, and we had dirt floors and all this stuff. And I'm like,
that's not the point. Yeah.
Well, it's also missing a huge problem that 100% generational trauma, ancestral trauma exists. Like there's multiple studies that talk about it. Like the environments we exist in affect our DNA and then affect several generations in the future's DNA.
Yeah.
So it's like them being like, see, we're fine. It's not a big deal. It's like, no, you're also need deep healing, have a lot of things that are potentially not working, drug, alcohol, just like all these things that are fucking up their lives. And individualism, this neoliberal kind of existence is just like, oh, it's your fault. It's about your life. It's about your choices. And it's like, yes, that's true, but also there's an entire legacy in which you sit on. And like, even your lack of success is because of that legacy, as much as your success is too, as much as it creates the privilege, it also creates all the shit that you need to work through and you need to heal. So it's kind of weird to be like touting that and being like proud of, oh, well, we don't worry about that. It's like, no, your life's directly affected by that still.
And that's the non-linear time, past, present, future, interpenetrating each other.
And there's the pull yourself up by the bootstraps thing. Like one person in particular who made that said that to me. Well, I've had quite a few people tell me that same story or whatever. They're doing fine now. They grew up poor and all this, and their parents grew up poor and all this, but they've got big houses now, and like their ability to work their way up is easier because of the way that our culture like places them within the framework and like constellation of society, versus I hardly ever, even though so many black people work the land there for white folks as sharecroppers or as slaves or as help or whatever, very few own land and still farm because they never were able to like buy it. There's some that are now, but like, and have, but like,
Yeah.
or keep it or something, you know. There's definitely black farmers in the South that like have been doing their own thing, but like I just noticed that's just something I've observed. I'm like, I don't know, like that ability to like to farm and make your own choices about that land that you're taking care of, and then give it to your kids or whatever. It's just like you don't see that, you know.
Yeah, it's not that simple. I've heard closer to home here for me, like growing up like right on the Ute reservation and close to the Navajo reservation, I've heard people say like, well, if the reservation is so shitty, they can just leave. You know, why don't they just leave? And that is like, I know they, you know, they really don't understand what they're saying because there's like this massive gap of cultural context that they don't have when it comes to like, you don't understand like they like just a reservation it's like its own country with its own culture, its own language, its own protocol, its own everything, its own traditions. And like, I don't think you understand. It's like, I don't think they realize how culturally insensitive it is to say like, well, if it's so shitty, then why don't they just leave and just like.
Well, it's shitty because of what happened.
Yeah. Yeah. And just like.
It's like people's whole ancestral fucking worlds. I don't know, like people's worlds are built from the place where they are.
Exactly. They don't understand that place-based identity and like family and tradition and like taking care of your elders and taking care of the land. Like leaving home isn't that simple for some people, you know.
And it brings something up too of like, you know, when you know, these, like you said, you have friends that have, you know, gotten out of that, or they've like done better than their parents, right? And there's like this big push to, it's kind of interesting how like the parents work to lessen the suffering of their kid or try to instill in values in them within the system that they live in is good. Like I think about this a lot with, I mean, definitely reservations and stuff too. It's like, yeah, you know, we don't want you to suffer as we've suffered, but literally the only way for you to not do that is to like enter into the society that is not yours and forget who you are, you know, and that's the only option. And so it's a weird thing of like, you know, what our parents are doing to lessen that suffering and create privilege for us, you know, these like the way, like, I mean, I would not be able to think and do the things I've done without my parents' work on it themselves, you know, but it also pushes it away because also all that suffering was created in the very system that they're in now. Like colonialism all over the world just like created all this suffering for these families, and they're going like, well, you've got to get out of this suffering and go into the system that created it in the beginning. It's just like, I mean, when do you stop that? And again, it just wants to homogenize so that everybody is part of it, you know, is paying into it. And
it wants to homogenize.
Right?
Again, back to no diversity, no
homogenization.
And again, like the monocropping thing, like some disease is going to come along, and because we're all the same, we're all homogenized, it's going to take all of us out, as opposed to having all these different cultural and you know, differences that can manage change and disaster.
like towns. Towns are ecologies. They are cultural landscapes, and our cultural values are reflected in them along with our own behaviors. I've been thinking about that because when I go into towns, I'm like, man, something so cool about towns, like when all of like the old fruit trees that are heavy with fruit, like the settlers came and planted this, and they left this legacy of like contaminated water from mining, but then they also left this other legacy of like heavy bearing fruit trees all over the place that bears are now eating and then go and poop out, and then they plant more of them, and I'm like, I can't feel one way about towns now. And
yeah, and the problem with like getting so black and white on like white people harvesting wild foods and stuff is there's a problem with, to me it's kind of like, it's like white people going, okay, well, hands off, I'm not going to do it. But the reality is that
anything I
native,
touch is gonna fucking explode on my head.
and you know that humans are directly negatively impactful to the environment. And the reality is that colonization happened. Indigenous people do not still have that knowledge, or do not have the time, or do not have the privilege to even practice it. And if it's gone forever, it's gone forever. Whoever keeps it, as long as you keep in mind the legacy in which it's coming from, I don't think it's a problem. Like, and it's so crazy to think like, you know, white people shouldn't be doing ceremony and white people shouldn't be doing this and that. And yeah, don't just start doing it because you saw it on TV, but like do it if you've been taught it by people, you know, that. And I mean, the reality is like I've learned so much from my culture, and it's been written by white hands. Like I've written about that like, you know, we laugh at white hands for our ancestors, like dust, hair, blood, like, because that's their, I mean, this guy fucking Morris Opler, he chronicled almost every single Apache myth, like all the Apache tribe myths, the use of peyote, and like all of that. Like there's two speakers now, you know, it's like these stories would have been gone. And so it's just this weird space of like going, oh, white hands off. It's like, no, you got to fix what you did. And you fix what you did not by going white hands off. You fix it by like getting in right relationship with it. Mm-hmm. And like, if that means there's innovation and it's not just the way that natives used to do it. Again, natives don't want to stay this. We get this traditionalist romantic viewpoint, but it's like they were innovating all the time, and it's not negative. So like for you
look
to
at the example of the horse.
Yeah. You know, that's exactly what it is like our Apaches are known for horses and muskets, like, and that completely changed how we lived our lives. And that wasn't negative. I mean,
look what happened when Geronimo got his hands on a rifle.
Yeah, exactly. It's just technology.
I think that like a lot of what I'm seeing around like this hands off that white folks should in wildcraft, and like me being really like interested in what wildcraft actually means to people is one thing, and also what wild means, because like I was saying, private land ownership becomes a part of that, which is like a colonialist thing that we've imposed on the land, right? Like that on this side of the fence it's wild, on this side of the fence it's not, and you can only do what's on this side of the fence and not partake in what's on this side of the fence. But that's just like, it's reinforcing that, and it's reinforcing that like these divides of things, but also like I think, and it doesn't really actually acknowledge tending practices of the land that blur the line between cultivated and wild, so-called wild. And that's something we've been talking about a lot. The more you learn about wild tending and about how humans like have literally affected the way that plants grow together with human, like, it's like, how can you even call anything purely so-called wild? Because how do we know how much, I mean, like, is anything that humans don't interact with considered wild?
That's the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve myth, trading our like lives, you know, and we're like reenacting that myth. And one of the coolest examples that's actually accessible to people to counter that is this Planet Earth series that they did in cities in India, and it was like the best, most fruitful video footage series on wild animals that they got was actually in these cities in India, where they like actually one guy actually got footage like literally right on the edge of a city of what are those it's not a jaguar but a leopard hunting a boar on the edge of the city, and then they're like like all these baboons and monkeys and all these wild animals, like wild boars, like in the city streets and stuff. And they were like, how in these cities the people don't like try to push the animals out of the city. The animals like are just as much at home in the cities as the people are. And like the people on planet Earth were like, this was like the coolest filming project we've done yet, because we got more action and more cool perspectives on wildlife in these cities than we have like literally anywhere else we've ever done it. And I think that's like a cool example of like how they're like a living example of how like cities
the city
are
is
like
wild too,
or like wild, yeah, you know.
And so like this, a lot of the arguments I see are like, well, if you grow it in a garden and it was a wild plant, then it's okay because then you can control its populations or whatever.
God, yeah. People are calling
or like
dandelions.
But like, not everybody has access to a fucking garden. People are guilting each other over picking dandelions or burdock. I'm like,
but then they're also calling dandelions and burdock settler colonialist plants too.
It's just people are so just they're just angry.
There's a lot of, but there's a lot of white people doing this to other white people too.
And well, it's
because everyone wants to be the right white person that's like the most PC.
Self-flagellation.
And it's just, it all comes back to like the myth of conservation of like, you know, I was like the white sage and the Palo Santo for sure is like, okay, don't buy that. It's not from here. You're like bringing it really far, and it's just, if it's not your medicine. But like white sage, like if you grow white sage, use it. Like, you know, don't go take it like, you know, in mass quantities without knowing who uses it and everything like that. But to just like completely X off things to again, it's kind of, for me, it's kind of like the I don't see color vibe of just like, oh, put it all back into their hands so we don't have to be accountable. And there's times when tribes will ask like, okay, we don't want you on these lands because they're like, that's the last thing that they have. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, the world's not changing. Like, I'd rather have people have relationships with it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like all these people picking things and they're going to get called out by people and maybe they picked it wrong for a couple years. But the reality is that if they're making a relationship with it, they'll make sure it's around. They're going to be, that's how you do real conservation. I think like the real conservationists are also all these biologists that are just out there and see everything happening. They're like, it's all dying. And that's all they do. They just go, it's all dying. Let's not mess with it more. It's like, no.
Well, not messing with certain things makes them die.
Exactly.
You know?
I walk around here and, you know, I try to avoid some plants and then some plants. And then I realize like there's so many plants that like rely on things being stepped on and being eaten and like being munched on. If that doesn't happen, they literally get sick.
I think that's something so missing weird. From the anti-well crafting conversation is like by not engaging with certain plants, they suffer. And literally some plants we talk about disturbance, moderate disturbance. We're thinking about disturbance a lot and like what amount of disturbance is good and what amount of disturbance becomes bad. And I think that like as people who are settlers on this land, like being a part of helpful disturbance actually and then creating more abundance from that helpful disturbance can actually be a good way of like improving what was done wrong in the past or something. Like I don't think the whole hands-off thing in a way feels more harmful to me, but I think where the root of where that's coming from too is like people seeing each other commodify for a lot of money plants online, and it feels weird to some people, you know. And like the whole wild foods becomes trendy and then only in San Francisco and the fanciest restaurants can you buy. That's where it becomes like people are like, what the fuck?
And then in marketing, there's like that yogurt company called Forager. You know?
Yeah.
I get that, you know, but I think it's oversimplified. The reactionism of that is oversimplified and problematic, you know?
Yeah. There's a leftover crack song I used to listen to a lot as a teenager called You Can't Go Home and You Can't Stay Here. And now I'm seeing that song with a completely different meaning of like what that saying you can't go home and you can't stay here, where I see like the white liberal anarchists and just like people in general are like doing that to themselves in this weird act of self-righteous social justice self-flagellation
Yeah.
of like, well, you can't go home and you can't stay here. Sorry, like no matter what you do, you're just like a piece of shit. And the reality is, and I've heard Nicholas Redbird say this, and it really impacted me when he said it, is like, when he said it about California, you have millions of people that live in California that aren't indigenous to California, but they're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
So we need to make them native, you know, like if people can start taking responsibility. And I think about like in terms of deep time, like when are you all of a sudden like not a settler and become a native, you know, because like the Utes, for example, that lived here, they migrated here. Like at least in southern Colorado where I'm from, they migrated there and displaced the Pueblo people that used to live there, you know? And at what point do you become, and this is like a sensitive thing to say, and I want to acknowledge that, but it's also something that like I think needs to be said of like, that it kind of, we need to break through the you can't go home and you can't stay here thing that's happening and take responsibility and start creating like place-based identity for ourselves, and then like by taking responsibility for like our role in place, and like this kind of ties into the whole reparations thing where I feel really skeptical about a lot of the reparations, in the sense that I see a lot of lip service reparations and like symbolic like lip service reparations, and like that's not really a reparation if it's just lip service, you know, like reparation is like relationship, you know, like reparations is like having individual relationships with people and landscapes and plants, not like social media posts and
saying
like
you paid
and saying
this
that
much money to some tribe, or
yeah,
you gave
it's like
Well, that's the only way that people know how to do it, you know?
yeah.
But the thing about the migration thing that's so interesting, I think it's only problematic because it's been used as an excuse to move people. Where it's like, oh, well, you only came here like 600 years ago. You're just an immigrant too. You know, like you don't actually have hold to this land. And it's like, it's crazy to think about like how fast cultures adapt. Like, yes, for native folks, after like 1,000 years, the sense of time is gone, you know? It's like, yeah, my creation story is here in this place because since time began, and time began has only been extended because of our scientific discoveries, you know? And so you don't have to think about that so fucking literally. Like, just think about it as like, you know, like Apaches moved in, we're Dene. We come from we're Athabascan. We come
Northern
from
people.
Yeah, you know, and so they made migrations down there. But if you're in any place for a couple hundred years, you build that landscape. It becomes your language. Your creation stories reflect it. Like, and then you have belonging to it. So I'm so behind that, what Redbird says, because it's just like people have to become indigenous. And that's the whole thing, is that like, we're not going to save this world by going, okay, well, let the natives take care of it. We'll just give it back to them. Let's just conserve land and then give it. They can't even do that, dude. They're fucking destroyed from colonization. Like they can't, it's like some tribes can. Some tribes have monetary, you know, they have casinos and things and they can like work on these projects, but we just need everybody to start being in right relationship with land. And that's all the stuff I was talking about yesterday with the reason I want to write that book is just to be like, what does that look like? Like, how can you make meaning and purpose in your life outside of capitalism?
Yeah.
And be in
in a
relationship
modern
with land,
lens, using modern technology, intertwined with modern technology, and that's something refreshing to hear, because I hear purists saying we need to go back to this. I hear some people saying that no, we need to separate everyone into their, you stay in your corner and you stay in your corner, and that's the way to do it, and that's how you undo the harm. And
it's just so chaotic that people can't think about.
What was that word you said? The
Transcommunality.
Transcommunality.
Yeah, it's too chaotic, and people want to separate and organize, and it's like, no, you just have to deal with the fucking chaos and the reality of history. Is that like, but the only thing that really should be there is that like, if you can reach out to the native folks and they're willing, and then they can lead the way with the knowledge. And you can bring all the modern technology in with it. You can support, you know. It's not like people want to live off of fucking wells they have to pump by hand every day, or like be reliant on springs, you know. It's like, of course not. That doesn't help. That doesn't steepen their connection with that land. Like if they have a pump that's doing it, you know, it's like, it's just, I don't know.
That's an interesting thing to think about, because like being reliant on something that makes things easier being on the land. It's just the reality that we live in now. And so where is that place between, I don't know, you speaking to your story last night and like how you want to give a different perspective to the urban and like the stories and the ancestors and like the like connections in the urban, so-called urban, you know, and the reality is like, yeah, the computer as a tool to share or to like communicate with other people across the world or whatever has a spirit in it too, and like we have to like, instead of ignore that and say it's just a bad thing,
or that it's just an object too.
Yeah, no object is really just an object without spirit, you know.
Absolutely.
I think about that a lot, like, well, if everything is God and if everything is like, or the spirit, great spirit, or whatever you want to call it, like that even the most toxic, fucked up things, the mines, the big metal building that seems to have no life, is all coming from that, and it will go back to that. And even though it created something that has poison in it in some way, like we still need to like see the spirit in it, you know.
Yeah, and take
responsibility.
Exactly, take responsibility for it, to go like, okay, where do these metals come from? All right, let's make a relationship with that. You know, oh, there's something not good going on there. It's like the central tenet of making everything like sacred and making it part of your placemaking and like allowing it to give you purpose and meaning, and like, I mean, just imbuing your world with meaning also means you have to take responsibility for it. It's like, oh, these like child indentured workers are mining all these materials. Well, I still need the computer. I still like them. Okay, how do I change this? You know, I have to make a relationship with it, and making a relationship means taking responsibility for it. And that's why the conservation thing and like, yeah, and this whole like call out thing, and people are terrified to make moves. I'm like, I'd rather a bunch of white folks mess up but still try to make relationship with land than just to be like, oh, well, that's all hands off for me.
Mm-hmm.
I'll never do it.
Because I don't want to fuck up. And
I don't want
to get fuck up and then get rejected by all my like.
Everyone's afraid of getting canceled by making one wrong move, you know.
And it is
like,
bad to be out there just like without even an attempting to do it in a right way, but just being like, yeah, this is all mine. I just take it. I don't even see it. And like, you know, you have to change that central mindset first.
Yeah.
But that's not even that hard, I don't think. I think people are desperate for like, when people start connecting with spirit in whatever way, if they can like break down their models of how they see the world enough to allow those kind of abstract experiences in, people are moved by it. There's a reason people flock to ayahuasca. There's a reason people flock to these medicines, because they're just like, my life fucking sucks on a bunch of levels.
But then
and
when
I
you
need to
have
fix it.
some white people making a lot of money off ayahuasca in the States, then where does that become like a problem? You know, it's like,
and
like the medicine itself is pure and like, and it can benefit anyone, but then like, where is it harming the actual medicine or harming I don't know. It's like,
it's again the extractive. They go down there for a weekend and do it, and then come back and there's no relationship with the land. There's no relation, and that's the thing with all the medicines. And that's why for me, having a lineage of medicine is like, that's my medicine. I'm not going to try other ones because I have that lineage. But there's all these people who don't have that.
Yeah.
And they need something, but you can't just buy it. Like, you have to have a relationship with it.
Yeah.
There has to be a context with it, and it'll be more powerful.
Those medicines are of that place, so it comes back to place and ecology. Like when the Huichol go out to get their peyote, they do this whole journey. They do a whole like fasting journey to go out and hunt it with a bow, and they do everything backwards, and it's like an ordeal, you know, that's centered in that place, in that desert, you know, and
but it just like all of those things, I really want to see people having like those kind of like liminal experiences where they're just like, they feel connected to all of creation. They feel connected to something larger than themselves.
Yeah.
And you don't even have to be like Christian or have any of these kind of concepts. It's just that like, oh, I'm part of this web of life, and that's actually really, there's something that's super powerful there. And people just doing like backpacking trips and just being like, yeah, nature's great, but not, it's just, there's like some disconnect there. And that's why I think what you guys do with like going out and being like, no, we're going to learn all the plants. We're like looking at all the ecologies. We're going to plant things. It's like, that is just direct responsibility. And even if you fuck up along the way, it's like, that's still 10 times more useful than.
Yeah.
Some people are definitely skeptical because, like, again, the conservation perspective is that you don't touch, and so people are afraid that you're going to plant something invasive that's going to destroy the pristine ecology and all this and that.
But we're also trying to shatter this illusion of pristine ecology.
Look at the mines everywhere. We're in the middle.
Funny that
all these trees are dead. Like,
we're in the wilderness.
People will call this pristine wilderness.
This needs work and help.
Yeah, like we're next to a stream that's like red from iron oxide from mines and stuff, but people still have the nerve to call it like pristine wilderness.
I mean, of course, it is fucking gorgeous and totally different than being in a city, but it's like
there's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And that's why I love what Redbird says when he's like he goes to that oak savanna or that oak woodland, and he's just like, the first thing I see is that there's a lot of work. It's like, we got to burn down all the poison oak. We got to burn in here. You know, there's just, and some animals can't even come through here anymore. You know, it's just, it's like, it's just,
there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah, like, God bless Thoreau, but also fuck him. Like, he's just like, just so romanticized the wilderness to a point where people are just like, there's no responsibility.
Yeah.
There's none.
Yeah,
It's
wilderness is like this objectification of the land where like we can still live like these ecocidal lives, but then come out to the wilderness to like escape our insane ecocidal lives and objectify it, because people treat it as like an object of their enjoyment, and you see it in like the propaganda and the signboards about
like 30 ATVs we saw on the way in here that just destroy
recreationists, you know, you call them rec creationists, like creation wreckers, the rec creationists, you know, and the objectification of the land is no different than the objectification of each other and of everything, you know, and when you objectify the land, you inherently can't see yourself as like an integral part of it, you know.
That's how I feel about all the, that goes into all the meat eating stuff too, of just like, you know, people doing, again, like escaping ecocidal, you know, living to either come out to the wilderness or adopting some value-oriented eating thing. And they're going like, well, I just did my part. And I'm like, there's so much more that could be done, you know? And, I don't know, just the whole meat eating thing is just like, you realize that if we don't eat meat and do so in right relation, I'm not talking about industrial farms either.
Yeah.
But then species die. Like, there's species that exist purely because we breed them too. And we control, I mean, it's just going back to like, we just control the world and we have to have a responsibility with it.
Some of the like anti-wildcrafting sentiment too, when it comes to animals, is like there's not enough deer to feed everybody. So we can't all eat wild meat. So what do you do about that? You know, like
we could change ecosystems to grow a lot more. But yeah, no, I do agree that, you know, you have to deal with the problem of the amount of people. And that's where urban centers are the only way to support that many people.
How much open lands in the Midwest that used to be buffalo and prairie, like if we just allowed that to be buffalo and prairie again, we would have plenty of food for everybody.
I know.
It's like,
or if like the overpopulation thing, I feel skeptical about, because
totally.
Think about what it would be like if 8 billion people took responsibility and made it like their priority to like be land stewards and plant and tend, you know. Like it would be different if you have, I think we're overpopulated because we have 8 billion mostly ecocidal people that don't give a fuck. But if we had 8 billion responsible indigenous humans that gave a fuck and that took responsibility and stewarded the land and like gave back more than they took, then we wouldn't be overpopulated.
Well, and it's just like, you know, if people were that way and this whole area looked different, like all these pines were removed to make way for other plants, and yes, the ecosystem would change, but as long as it wasn't purely an extractive and like industrial mindset that was doing it, it's like, yeah, the ecosystem's changing, but it's also providing so much more. There might be other species that start to develop there, you know, new plants grow, new animals come in. It's just like, it just comes back to, you know, like we control this. and there's nothing to keep, like, there's things to keep from going extinct because we need that biodiversity to even be healthy in the future.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's just like, that's why Japan is so interesting, because this is really where I got this idea, is in college, is doing this like anthropological report on how Japan views the wilderness. And they're like, it doesn't exist. They say land managed by human hands is the most beautiful. And it's like that's how you honor creation, is by managing it. So that's why they make entire forests of cherry blossoms, and they do all these things. And for sure, there's probably plants that died, but the reality is that they're not going to let their salmon go. They started in insanely like complicated hatchery tracking systems to keep their salmon alive. And we're in this weird conservation mindset where it's like, oh, we just have to get rid of the dams. Like, yeah, sure, we can get rid of the dams. But again, it's the hands-off thing. It's like, okay, clear the way and then give it back to the salmon. But then there's all these other factors that are killing the salmon.
Yeah.
And we're not tending those. And we go, oh, good job, we took out the dam.
Yeah.
It's like, but all the salmon are fucking dying.
Fire suppression and clear cuts too. Like, if we're going to take out the dam, then we need to address like fire suppression, and then the logging and mining industries too that also destroy salmon habitat. And
Well, but it comes back to like, what's wrong with using technology? What's wrong with using fisheries? Yeah.
Wind.
But like doing fisheries, managing all of it, and just doing it in a way that's holistic, where you're going, okay, what are all the outputs of doing it this way?
Yeah.
We're smart enough to figure that out. Like, we're not. Like, people are always surprised, it's like, it's so easy to figure out how ecosystems work together in my mind. Like, we've been doing that our entire existence, and to treat it like this, like, crazy science that you have to
get a degree.
You have to get a degree, and you have to measure just like how much methane per whatever is in the water, and it's like, no, like, just watch for a year and see what happens and adjust. Like, it's just
that's profound. That's an encouraging and empowering people to become, I guess, a citizen scientist, to go out and make your own observations and to see for yourself. Like, that's powerful, because then it's accessible to people. Then when people realize that knowledge is accessible through their own ability to go out and observe, that's where you can have some really amazing results, when people go out and like see for themselves what's happening, and then they can start to see like the double standards and the narratives like espoused by our cultures that aren't correct, because they're getting out and seeing for themselves. Like, observation is powerful. Humans are just very observant when we allow ourselves to be in. I've learned more about permaculture just through observing the landscape through the lens of wild tending. I've like never done anything in relation to permaculture really, but like I understand permaculture in a whole different way just from getting out and observing and seeing it through this lens, And then when I picked up a book on permaculture and I read through the stuff, I was like, wow, that's really everything we've already been doing.
It's not as complicated as people want it to be. There's a lot of things that are helpful. The other problem is, though, is just that people don't have time.
No.
Because they have to capitalize on their time in every moment.
Yeah, like I said, like me in particular, is like a hold all these values and all these knowledge, but I know that for me to survive and to get out what I want to get out in the world, I can't live out those values. I can't be doing wild tending. I can't I can do it here and there and like learn more about it, but yeah, it has to be like a hobby, which until we like change how we utilize our time and productivity and how the world moves, then we really can't attend to it in a direct way,
How do you do that when it feels like beyond your control? Like rent, for example. Rent cost is like this collective, I don't know, like that feels like beyond your control when you're just looking for an affordable place to live.
Yeah, you can't. I'm not going to think about wild tending if I fucking can't figure out my next meal, even though that could save me from my next meal. The world has to change. And, I think some people get really doomsday and go like, great, a pandemic that'll change how people live in the world. And that's true. And it could. And like these very tragic, intense ecological events could just shift how people are in the world. And that's how people are like, well, we just got to start over and we just need to, but I don't know. culture changes faster than people want to admit, and we get like really stuck, but like 3 generations and everything could change, you know, just everything. We could change literally how we do everything, and it wouldn't even be that crazy. It's just,
It doesn't have to be going back to living in huts either.
no, and that's yeah.
I don't think it will either.
No, it would be stupid.
We could see you just think about the world's supply chain and how unsustainable and how ecocidal that is, and how like either that's going to stop itself for us beyond our control, or we're going to have to stop that. But like whether change happens in the best way possible, there is going to be like some sort of like screeching halt and complete dismantling of everything we've known to shift into I don't even like the word sustainable, more of like a regenerative, reciprocal life way. If we're going to do that, even in the best case scenario, if it happens the smoothest it could possibly go,
Still needs to happen.
there's going to be like an abrupt crashing halt to like, because this system has so much momentum.
And everything is informed by capitalism. The systems that don't make sense, they're like that because someone can make more money around it not making sense. Like to like catch a fish, you know, in Washington State, and then you send it to China to get processed and put in a can, and then you get it sent back to the U.S. to get labeled, and then you get it sent back to China to get distributed or something like that. Like how do we change things like that? Because that's what makes the most money. It's like,
I mean, to me,
you know?
part of it is like a whole generation has to die. And the harsh reality is that like we're too late on a lot of fronts, and there's going to be a lot of ecosystem collapse, you know? But that doesn't mean we just like shrug our shoulders and
feel like everything's fucked.
everything's fucked. It's like, no, we can bring it back. And it won't be conserved. It won't be the ecosystem.
Look like it looked 200 years ago.
But we can do what we've been doing as humans for hundreds of thousands of years.
We underestimate the resiliency, because we are ecological beings, and ecology is like resilient and adaptable.
That's why we love Russian olive, even though people love to hate Russian olive because it's invasive. But like, you go through Salida and some of these really dry valleys here, or go through Nevada, there's just the biggest thing that seems to thrive in like the polluted mine waste fucking desert
is Russian olive. And then
and that makes food and it fixes nitrogen.
Who's eating all the berries? You see like the bird habitat that it creates. And speaking of, look at our little friends coming here to hang out with us.
Oh, hey.
But yeah, the amount of, I've found like so many different kinds of animal shit with Russian olive seed in it. And if you ever want to like see birds, go to Russian olive groves when they're in fruit. And I also realized, you know, with this whole topic of invasives, is like they are the scapegoat for our behavior. You know, we don't take any responsibility and we put all the blame on them, when like us as hyper keystone ecological engineers, so to speak, we are creating most of the niches for these plants. And like
they've already been created.
And I reflected on the driveway. I used to walk home like half a mile every day through cattle pasture when the bus would drop me off after school. And in this cattle pasture, there was a man-made wetland because there was a pond dammed on the other side of the road. And that dam had a spring coming out of the bottom of it, which fed this big wetland. And they would run cows there a couple times a year. And that many cattle, even a couple times a year, like over the years, it really compacted that soil. And I walked that road my whole life. And then just a few years ago, I realized, and I was just reflecting on this, on this topic of how we create niches. But just a couple years ago, the Russian olives started to pop up.
Right,
and they grow fast. And they popped up in that little wetland that's been really compacted by cattle. And I walked that driveway for like probably over 13 years back and forth, and there was never Russian olives there. But then all of a sudden they started popping up, and there was Russian olives like right down the field from them, you know, in other cattle pastures, but never here. But then within the past 5 years, they started popping up and they grew really fast. And I started asking, like, is that
we create that niche for them? You know, we created a wetland. That's a human created wetland, and we put cattle there over and over again that compacted that soil. What I think people don't do and need to do is start asking why and what these plants are indicating. Like, why are they there and what are they indicating? What are they reflecting back to us about our behavior? Because that, I think, is really what they're doing but instead we demonize them and say, no, these plants are fucking this up and they're invasive.
Well, they're
and
not
we need
pure
to kill
because
them.
they weren't there 200 years ago.
Yeah,
I think about what
know.
you were talking about last night with your Indigenous futurism project, and like, what does the future look like? Not trying to like recreate the past, although respecting tradition is
a ton of knowledge.
yeah. It's also like realizing that we're gonna have plants that are gonna grow out of the sidewalk, and we need to let them, you know, and honor their spirits.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up the purity thing, because that's like this Christian concept, you know, and it's like manifest destiny was taming things, making things pure, making things organized, and it didn't see what was already, it didn't see all of that wisdom and knowledge that was there in that landscape already. Mm-hmm. You know, it wasn't, and it all comes back to essentially racism and like colorism and you know, we've got to whiten things up. And the purity concept again, is just
homogenize things.
And we've got to get rid of that, because that's not God's way. And I'm like, bro,
it's the whole kill the Indian, save the child.
Yeah, save the man. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the purity thing is huge too, of like, and that's where I get really into the archetypal stuff between masculine and feminine, how like masculine really wants to control and order and in the same way be generative, like create things, but at the same time it's like the feminine being, you know, more chaotic in that it just grows, you know, and when there's not a balance of that, or masculine is not in service to that growth in the feminine where it can help it grow in its best way possible, as opposed to just like going, that's too much, that's overwhelming, that chaos is too much, let's control it. And I think that just dynamic runs through not only our personal relationships between men and women and them and masc people, but also just the wilderness and just everything, about anything that's uncontrollable or too emotional or chaotic and looking. It's like, we've got to.
It's like the Dionysian and the Apollonian.
I haven't thought of it. I mean, I have thought of it that way, but the way you frame it is different. It's interesting. Like these plants that we call invasive, even plants that are so-called native, are called invasive because of the way they behave. In that way that we want to put that control on them, because it makes us uncomfortable to see them behave in like a way that feels flowing and like.
And also simultaneously, what is labeled invasive always has to do with like how it affects economic inputs of any sort, you know. So if a plant, it has the potential to be very economically profitable, then it's not going to be invasive, you know. So that is one thing that like we've been trying to point out to people, is to question like where these narratives come from and who funds these narratives and who has like the funding to like put out this powerful propaganda, and like follow the money to the sources of these stories, and then question that. Because
also, if you don't have like a 30 to 50 year view of an ecosystem and you're calling something invasive, you have no idea. Like there's so many ways that the forest will get covered in invasives, and then 5 years later the pines come and then they grow taller, and then another ecosystem develops. You know, and it's like it's just, you see that after fires all the time. It's like people are sad because it's not all the trees, but it completely opens it up for other ecosystems, other plants to come through. And
I mean, all this dead spruce we're seeing.
It's going to be big in like 10 years, 15 years.
It's going to be a big old fire coming through here, probably. Or they're all going to fall. It's still a lot of fuel, but something else will happen, you know?
And I think about this a lot, and I've been trying to articulate this in a meaningful way that is like accessible for people. Is like, we need people living on these I'm just going to use the term wild lands, even though I'm just going to use that term. We need people living on wild lands with wild lands, managing wild lands, and to like decentralize that power and authority and responsibility from like the government, USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Forest Service, and because there's so much land that's been neglected for so long. And the Forest Service manages land with profit motive in mind first, but we need people to start living with these lands and understanding them, and then starting to take responsibility and going through, like, obviously these landscapes are not capable of having healthy controlled burns because there's been over 100 years of fire suppression.
Totally.
So we need people living with these landscapes, tending them, so we can actually do that in a good way first.
Yeah. That's why I do like, these concepts of Green New Deals, but again, you have to like completely root out colonial, racist, white,
What's Green New Deals?
Well, Green New Deal is just pretty much like creating entire economies around forest management and solar energy and government incentives to actually do this. But you have to get rid of those concepts of purity. You have to get rid of those concepts. Like, you have to completely change how we think about it first to do that in a way that's really going to be healthy. And that's where indigenous knowledge, I'm just like, let that lead the way. Like, if people are teaching you and native people are trying to tell you what to do, fucking listen.
Yeah,
oh my God. And not because you're guilty, but just because you go, wow, you have a lot of knowledge. You have thousands and thousands of years of knowledge built into your creation stories and your oral histories. But if we just take a little tiny bit of time to sit with that and decipher that and break that down, there's just endless knowing there.
Yeah.
And we just have to value it enough to actually give it the time of day.
Yeah.
Or wait 100 years for white scientists to use biomimicry to come up with the things and go, look at what we figured out. And it's like, bro,
I think, and
we've been
that's
trying
just
to tell you that for a while.
That unconditioning, like our inherent racism that we inherit from just being in this culture and growing up in this culture, that like, our culture is like, because if our culture and our science can't come up with it, then anybody else who says it in a different way is just like inferior and invalid, because like we've invested that authority and that godlike power into science and into medical science and into these like institutions that if they don't come up with it for us, then so like when like dark-skinned indigenous people are telling us these things, we literally don't take them seriously. And I think that is rooted in like just white supremacy, and that.
Yeah. So yeah, like, and if we had a Green New Deal and we're not dealing with those concepts of purity and like trying to manage everything to a T and like not pay attention and that, a bunch of stuff, then it's going to be a problem. But yeah, and that's really, like, anthropology has a horrible rap because it did a lot of damage.
Yeah.
But it's also such a powerful tool for translating, for being a middle ground,
Yeah.
Like, I'm so glad I was trained in anthropology, even though it's not been kind to Native peoples in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it's some of the things that saved Native peoples.
That's so interesting.
So,
I was thinking about this yesterday because I took an anthropology class in high school, ecology anthropology class, and I think about that bad reputation that anthropologists have gotten, rightfully so, but then I also like really enjoyed that anthropology class, even though I didn't know about any of that at the time. But just like there's also, I know of a lot of, especially in the Southwest, because Fort Lewis College gives all indigenous people free tuition, and there's a lot of people getting anthropology degrees. There's a lot of, especially in the Southwest, because there are so many reservation and native peoples, there's a lot of people doing anthropological studies as indigenous peoples, and I'm like curious to look at that and be like, what do y'all think of anthropology, and how are y'all using it, and like how are you all like helping transform the field of anthropology, into something that's not like
White people studying brown people.
Yeah, well, if it's not in that white saviorism mentality again of like, oh, we've got to, which I'm again thankful for, because like, man, so many languages would have been lost,
Yeah.
If there wasn't just white people coming in like, we're going to save you, while simultaneously doing nothing about all the shit that's killing them. But there's a I mean, it can be a really powerful tool to just bridge that gap. And that's why I mean, some of the ethnobotany work and the nutritional ethnobotany work is just so powerful, because it's like somebody puts in the time to go, we're going to listen, we're going to value indigenous knowledge, we're going to listen to it, we're going to write it down, and then we're going to do all the science to back it up and go, look at all the compounds in these plants and look at how they affect the human body, and like, and hopefully not just sell it to big pharma to make hell money, but like, you know, just to give credence to the indigenous people who have this knowledge, and they don't need to be like, they're like literally just, they're like, yeah, it's part of our,
they don't need it to be scientifically validated
to use it.
Yeah.
You just listened to a conversation out on the Colorado Trail that featured Gabriel Crawford, me, and Téo Montoya. And the music for this episode is made by Megapod, and the song is called Willow Call. And Megapod is actually a music project of Téo's, so I wanted to feature some of Téo's music on this episode. So I really liked how this song fit with the land-based way this episode was recorded. So you can find Téo's music in the show notes, along with other ways to find him. And I hope you enjoyed this episode, and until next time, y'all. This episode of the Ground Shots podcast was produced by Opia Creative. Our music is by Mother Marrow. If you'd like to help us continue to make this audio project a reality, consider becoming a monthly supporter on our Patreon page at patreon.com/ofsedgeandsalt, where we have rewards like entry into patron-only giveaways, additional audio interviews, extra educational content, and much more. You can also share our work and give us a review on iTunes. Visit our website at ofsedgeandsalt.com to see what else we're up to and a log of our episodes when they come out. Check out our show notes for information about how to find us and our guests. Until next time, y'all, thanks for listening.